Just kill me fast. Those were the first words Will Morgan heard from the dying woman hanging in a burlap sack from his cottonwood tree. He should have walked away, should have let the desert take her like it takes everything else. But something in her eyes, broken defiant still fighting, wouldn't let him. What he found under that blanket would drag him back into a world he'd sworn to leave behind. A world of blood silence and debts that never die. Stay with me until the end and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind that morning tasted like copper and dust. Will Morgan stood at the fence line of his property, one boot pressed against the lowest rail, watching the way the light broke over the Dragoon Mountains. It was the kind of sunrise that made a man think about God if he still believed in that sort of thing. Will didn't. Not anymore. Not since he'd buried Sarah beneath the cottonwood with nothing but a wooden cross and a promise he couldn't keep. The ranch wasn't much. 40 acres of stubborn earth, a house that leaked when it rained, and a barn that leaned like a drunk after last call. But it was quiet. And quiet was all Will had left. He'd been checking the fence for breaks. Coyotes had been getting bold again when he saw it. Something hanging from the cottonwood. At first he thought it was a feed sack, maybe blown loose from someone's wagon, but the shape was wrong. Too long, too deliberate. And when the wind shifted, he heard it, breathing, shallow, ragged, human. Will's hand went to the pistol at his hip, instinct older than thought. He approached slowly, boots crunching over dry grass, eyes scanning the tree line for movement. The desert taught you early nothing out here was what it seemed. The sack hung from a low branch tied with frayed rope that looked like it had been gnawed through by something or someone. Will drew his knife and cut it down. The sack hit the ground with a sound that made his stomach turn. Too heavy, too soft. He knelt and pulled the burlap away. A woman. Young. Maybe 20, maybe younger. Her face was sun-blistered and streaked with dirt and blood. Her hair was matted dark with sweat, and God knew what else. Her wrists were bound with rusted wire, the kind ranchers used for mending gates, and the skin beneath was raw and weeping. She wore the remains of a dress calico once white, now the color of old bone. But it was her eyes that stopped him. They were open, staring straight at him, not afraid, not pleading, just empty. Like she'd already made peace with dying. Her lips moved. Just kill me fast. The words came out in a whisper dry as the wind. Will stared at her. His hand hovered over the pistol. For a moment, just a moment, he considered it. It would be a mercy. Whatever she'd been through, whatever had brought her here, death might be kinder than dragging her back from the edge. But then she blinked. And in that blink, he saw something he recognized. Something he'd seen in his own reflection every morning for the past 3 years. The will to survive buried so deep it barely flickered. Not today, he said quietly. He slid his arms beneath her, one under her knees, one behind her shoulders, and lifted. She weighed nothing, a ghost made flesh. Her head lolled against his chest, and he felt the faint, irregular thump of her heartbeat. Still alive, barely. He carried her across the property, past the barn where his horse stamped and snorted, past the garden Sarah had planted that had long since gone to seed. The house stood at the center of it all, small and weathered, its porch sagging under the weight of too many silent years. Inside, the air was cool and stale. Will kicked the door shut behind him and laid her on the floor near the stove. He didn't have a proper bed, hadn't bothered keeping the bedroom after Sarah died. He slept in a chair most nights, or out on the porch when the memories got too loud. He fetched water from the barrel, tore a strip from an old shirt, and began cleaning the dirt from her face. She didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, just stared at the ceiling like she was looking through it into some other world. "Can you hear me?" he asked. No response. He checked her pulse, weak but steady. Her breathing was shallow, but it hadn't stopped. He unwound the wire from her wrists, slow, careful cursing under his breath at the damage. The wire had cut deep, and infection had already started to set in. He'd seen wounds like this before. Men who'd been tied to wagons and dragged. Prisoners left to rot in the sun. This was deliberate. This was punishment. Will cleaned the wounds as best he could, wrapped them in clean cloth, and covered her with the only blanket he had. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at her. "Who the hell are you?" he muttered. She didn't answer. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she'd forgotten. The first day she didn't move. Will checked on her every few hours, listening for the sound of breathing, watching for the rise and fall of her chest. He brought water, held it to her cracked lips, and let it trickle into her mouth. Most of it ran down her chin, but some went down. That was enough. He didn't know what else to do. He wasn't a doctor, wasn't a preacher. He was just a man who'd found something broken and didn't have the heart to leave it. On the second day, she opened her eyes. Will was sitting in the chair by the stove, mending a bridle, when he felt her gaze on him. He looked up. She was watching him, silent, wary, like a deer that hadn't decided yet whether to bolt. "You awake?" he asked. She didn't answer, just kept staring. He set the bridle aside and stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate, non-threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "You're safe here." Her eyes tracked him as he moved to the stove, poured a cup of broth from the pot he'd kept simmering. He crouched beside her, offering the cup. "You need to drink." She looked at the cup, then at him, then back at the cup. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up onto one elbow. Her hand shook as she reached for the cup. Will didn't help, didn't touch her. He just held it steady and let her take it. She drank. 3 small sips. Then she stopped, her face pale, and handed it back. "Good," Will said. "That's good." She lay back down, her eyes closing, exhaustion pulling her under again. That night he heard her crying. It wasn't loud, just soft, broken sounds that came through the thin wall between the main room and the corner where she lay. Will sat in his chair, staring at the darkened ceiling, listening. He didn't go to her, didn't say anything. Some wounds needed to bleed before they could heal. By the end of the first week, she could sit up on her own. She still didn't speak, didn't ask questions. But she watched him, watched the way he moved through the house, the way he cooked his meals, the way he checked the locks on the doors at night. She ate slowly, carefully, like she expected the food to be taken away. Will left her alone, gave her space, let her come to him in her own time. One morning he found her standing by the window looking out at the land. "It's not much, he said, coming up beside her. "But it's quiet." She didn't respond, just kept staring. "You don't have to tell me anything," Will continued. "Don't have to explain. But if you want to stay, you can. No strings, no expectations." She turned to look at him, then her eyes searching his face for something, a lie maybe, a trap. Whatever she found, it seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once, then turned back to the window. That afternoon she followed him outside. Will was splitting logs behind the barn when he felt her presence. He looked up. She stood a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself, watching. "You ever split wood?" he asked. She shook her head. He held out the axe. "Want to try?" She hesitated. Then slowly she stepped forward and took it. Will showed her how to position the log, how to grip the axe, how to swing with her whole body instead of just her arms. She listened without speaking, then raised the axe and brought it down. The log split clean in 2. She stared at it, then at the axe in her hands. Then, for the first time since he'd found her, she smiled. It was small, fragile, but it was real. The days began to blur together after that. She started helping around the ranch, small things at first, sweeping the porch, feeding the chickens, hanging laundry on the line. She moved like a ghost, silent and careful, never asking permission, never expecting praise. Will didn't push, didn't ask her name or where she'd come from. He figured she'd tell him when she was ready. Or maybe she wouldn't. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was healing. Her wrists began to mend, the color returned to her cheeks. She stopped jumping at every sound, stopped flinching when he moved too quickly. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to speak. It started with single words. "Thank you." "Yes." "No." Then short sentences. "The chickens need more feed." "I fixed the fence by the barn." And then one night she said something that made Will's chest tighten. They were sitting on the porch watching the stars come out. She was wrapped in the blanket, her knees pulled to her chest. Will was smoking a cigarette, letting the silence stretch between them. "You didn't touch me," she said quietly. Will looked at her. "No." "Why not?" He took a long drag, exhaled slowly. Because you didn't want me to. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, most men wouldn't have cared. I'm not most men. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for the first time he saw something other than fear in her eyes. Trust. It was fragile, tentative, like a bird testing the strength of a branch. But it was there. My name is Emma, she said. Will nodded. Will. I know, she said. I heard you talking to the horse. Despite himself, he smiled. Yeah, he's a better listener than most people. She almost laughed. Almost. That night she slept inside the house instead of on the floor. Will gave her the bedroom, the one he hadn't used in 3 years, and took the chair like always. He didn't sleep much, kept listening for sounds from the other room, but all he heard was steady breathing. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel so empty. 2 weeks after he'd found her, Will rode into town for supplies. He didn't like going into Tombstone. Too many people. Too many questions. But the ranch was running low on flour and coffee, and he needed to pick up some wire for the fence. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside. The place smelled like sawdust and tobacco. Old man Fletcher was behind the counter tallying figures in a ledger. Will Morgan, Fletcher said, not looking up. Didn't expect to see you. Need supplies, Will said, setting a list on the counter. Fletcher glanced at it, then at Will. You doing all right out there? Fine. Heard you've been keeping to yourself even more than usual. Will didn't respond, just waited. Fletcher gathered the items, flour, coffee, salt, wire, and set them on the counter. That'll be $4. Will paid in cash, took the supplies, and turned to leave. Will, he stopped. You hear about the girls? Fletcher asked. Will's jaw tightened. What girls be? 3 of them. Gone missing over the past few months. Sheriff's been asking around, but nobody's seen nothing. Fletcher leaned forward, lowering his voice. Folks are saying it's traffickers, men who snatch girls and sell them south of the border. Will's blood went cold. Anyone been caught? Not yet, but there's talk. Some of the ranchers near Bisbee saw strange men hanging around, asking about work, asking about other things. Fletcher's expression darkened. You see anything suspicious, you let someone know. Will nodded slowly. I will. But as he walked out of the store, his mind was racing. Emma's wrists, the brand on her skin he'd glimpsed one night when the firelight caught it just right. The way she'd looked when he'd first found her, like something hunted. She wasn't just lost. She'd been taken. But that night Will couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch staring out at the darkness, replaying Fletcher's words in his mind. 3 girls missing. Traffickers. Men who preyed on the vulnerable. He thought about Emma, about the way she still woke sometimes in the middle of the night gasping, about the scars on her wrists, about the way she'd begged him to kill her. Someone had done that to her, and they were still out there. The door creaked open behind him. Emma stepped out wrapped in the blanket, her bare feet silent on the wood. Can't sleep? She asked. No. She sat beside him, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Me neither. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of wind through the grass. Will? She said quietly. Yeah. Why did you save me? He didn't answer right away, just stared out at the horizon where the stars met the edge of the world. Because someone had to, he said finally. She looked at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. What if they come back? Who? The men who did this to me. Will turned to face her. His voice was low, steady, and filled with a quiet conviction that left no room for doubt. Then they'll have to go through me first. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, and for the first time since he'd found her, she leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat like that until dawn. 2 broken souls finding something neither of them had expected. A reason to fight. The morning after their conversation on the porch, Will woke to find Emma already up standing in the kitchen with flour on her hands. She'd found Sarah's old apron hanging on a nail by the pantry and tied it around her waist. The sight of it stopped him cold, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. For 3 years, that apron had hung there untouched, a relic of a life he couldn't return to. Now it looked like it belonged exactly where it was. "I'm making biscuits," Emma said without turning around. "Or trying to. I'm not very good at it." Will poured himself coffee from the pot she'd already brewed. Sarah always said the secret was keeping the butter cold. Emma's hand stilled for just a moment. Then she nodded. "I'll remember that." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, and afterward Will headed out to check the south fence line. The wire had been loose for weeks, and with summer coming on, the cattle would start pushing against it, looking for greener grass that didn't exist. He was halfway through tightening the third post when he saw them. Hoofprints. Fresh ones. 3 horses, maybe 4, cutting across his property line from the east. They'd come in sometime during the night, skirted the barn, and circled back toward the road. Will crouched down, studying the tracks. One of the horses was shod wrong. The left rear print showed a chip in the shoe, a distinctive notch that would be easy to recognize again. His jaw tightened. Nobody had any business riding through his land at night, and nobody who meant well traveled in a group like that, quiet and careful, avoiding the house. He followed the tracks to the property line, where they disappeared onto the hard-pan road that led to Bisbee. For a long moment he stood there, hand resting on the fence post, weighing his options. Could be drifters. Could be rustlers sizing up his cattle, not that he had enough to make it worth their while. Could be nothing. But Will Morgan hadn't survived 3 years alone in the Arizona Territory by assuming the best of people. He headed back to the house, his mind working through possibilities he didn't want to consider. Emma was hanging laundry when he returned, and she looked up as he approached, her expression immediately guarded. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Probably nothing," Will said. "But I want you to stay close to the house for a few days. Don't wander past the barn." Her face went pale. "They found me." "I don't know what I found, just tracks. But until I do, I want you where I can see you." She nodded, her knuckles white where she gripped the wet sheet. "Okay." That night, Will didn't sleep at all. He sat in the chair with his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness through the window. Every sound made him tense, the creak of the house settling, the scratch of branches against the roof, the distant yip of coyotes. Emma had gone to bed hours ago, but he could hear her moving restlessly in the next room, and he knew she wasn't sleeping either. Around 3 in the morning, she emerged from the bedroom wrapped in her blanket. "You should rest," she said quietly. "I'm fine." She sat down on the floor near his chair, pulling her knees up under the blanket. "Will you tell me about your wife?" The question caught him off guard. In 3 years, nobody had asked. Nobody who knew him would dare, and nobody who didn't know him cared. "Why?" he asked. "Because I want to know who you were before you found me." Will was quiet for a long time, staring at the rifle in his hands. Then he started talking, and once he started, he couldn't stop. Her name was Sarah. She was a school teacher's daughter from Denver, smart as hell and too brave for her own good. Came out here because she wanted to see the frontier. Said she was tired of living in her father's house, tired of being told what was proper and what wasn't. He smiled at the memory. She was 19 when I met her. I was working as a deputy in Tucson. She came into the office one day to report that someone had stolen her traveling bag, and she was so furious I thought she was going to pull a gun on me when I told her we probably wouldn't find it. Emma's lips quirked. "Did you find it?" "Found it, and arrested the man who took it. Turned out he'd been running a whole operation stealing from travelers at the station. Sarah came to the trial and sat in the front row every day taking notes like she was writing a newspaper article." Will's expression softened. Afterward, she thanked me by inviting me to dinner. 6 months later, we were married. "What happened to her?" The softness left his face. "Fever. Started in town and spread through the territory like wildfire. By the time the doctor made it out here, she was already gone. 23 years old." He was quiet for a moment. "I buried her under the cottonwood because it was her favorite tree. She used to sit under it in the evenings and read to me. Poetry mostly. Whitman. She loved Whitman." Emma's eyes were wet. "I'm sorry." "Me too. Is that why you left Tucson? Became a rancher?" "Part of it." Will set the rifle aside and leaned back in the chair. "The other part was I stopped believing there was any point to wearing a badge. You can arrest 100 men and there'll be 101 waiting to take their place. The law doesn't stop bad things from happening, it just punishes them after. He looked at her. I wanted to be somewhere where I didn't have to watch the world prove that to me every day. Emma was silent for a long time. Then she said, But you didn't stop being who you were. What do you mean? You saved me. You didn't have to, but you did. That's not a man who stopped caring. That's a man who still believes in something. Will didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. As dawn broke, Emma finally went back to bed, and Will made himself coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The land was washed in gold and pink light, beautiful and indifferent. He drank his coffee and watched the sun climb and tried not to think about the hoofprints that were still out there somewhere leading to men he couldn't see. The next 3 days passed quietly. Too quietly. Will worked the ranch with one eye always on the horizon, and Emma stayed close like he'd asked, though he could see the tension building in her shoulders, the way she flinched at every sound. On the 4th day, he rode into town again this time, with questions that needed answers. The sheriff's office in Tombstone was a small adobe building that smelled like old leather and tobacco smoke. Sheriff Tom Garrett was sitting behind his desk cleaning his pistol when Will walked in. He looked up surprised. Will Morgan. Twice in 1 month. I'm starting to think you miss civilization. Need information, Will said, getting straight to it. Fletcher mentioned missing girls. Garrett's expression turned serious. He set the pistol down and gestured to a chair. What do you want to know? Everything. The sheriff leaned back, his chair creaking. 3 girls in 4 months. First one was a rancher's daughter from Bisbee, 16 years old, disappeared on her way home from church. Second was a saloon girl from Tucson. Nobody paid much attention to that one until the 3rd girl went missing from right here in Tombstone, Baker's daughter, 15. Any leads? Not many. But there have been reports of strangers passing through, men nobody recognizes asking questions about work, about ranches, hiring, about families with daughters. Garrett's jaw tightened. One witness said she saw a wagon headed south with what looked like cargo covered in canvas. Said she heard crying, but by the time we got out there, the trail was cold. Will's hands clenched. What kind of men? The kind that know how to disappear. We're talking about traffickers, Will. Men who sell girls to brothels in Mexico, or worse. They move fast, they're organized, and they're careful. Garrett studied him. Why are you asking? Will hesitated. Then he said, found someone on my property. A woman. She'd been hurt, bound, and left to die. The sheriff sat forward. When? 3 weeks ago. Is she still alive? Yes. Can she identify who did it? She hasn't said much at all. Will met Garrett's gaze. But I saw a brand on her wrist, 3 letters, JKS. Garrett went very still. You're sure? I'm sure. The sheriff stood and walked to a filing cabinet, rifling through papers until he found what he was looking for. He laid a wanted poster on the desk. The sketch showed a hard-faced man with a scar running from his left eyebrow to his cheek. Below the image were the words Jacob Klein Sawyer, wanted for abduction assault trafficking. Reward $500. JKS, Garrett said quietly. Jacob Klein Sawyer. We've been tracking him for 2 years. He runs a network that stretches from Tucson to the border, snatches girls, breaks them, sells them. The ones that fight back. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Will stared at the poster, memorizing every line of that face. You know where he is? No, he moves around, uses different camps, different routes. Last we heard he was somewhere near the Dragoons, but that was a month ago. Garrett looked at him. If the woman on your ranch can identify him or any of his men, it could help us find him. She's not ready to talk about it. She's not ready, Will said firmly, and I'm not going to force her. Garrett sighed, but nodded. All right, but if she remembers anything, you bring her to me. And in the meantime, you watch yourself. If Sawyer thinks she's alive and can testify against him, he'll come looking. Let him. The sheriff gave him a long look. You're not a deputy anymore, Will. You go up against men like this alone, you'll get yourself killed. I'll keep that in mind. Will left the office and rode home, the wanted poster folded in his pocket and a cold fury burning in his chest. He knew men like Jacob Sawyer, had arrested men like him back when he still believed a badge meant something. They were predators, pure and simple. They didn't have consciences or regrets. They just took what they wanted and moved on, leaving wreckage in their wake. And one of them had hurt Emma. When he got back to the ranch, Emma was in the garden pulling weeds. She looked up as he approached, and something in his expression made her stand. "What happened?" she asked. Will dismounted and walked over to her. He pulled the wanted poster from his pocket and unfolded it. "Do you know this man?" Emma looked at the sketch. Her face drained of all color. The poster slipped from her fingers and fell to the ground. "Emma." She took a step back then, another her hand going to her throat. Her breathing came fast and shallow. Will reached for her, but she jerked away, her eyes wild. "Don't touch me," she gasped. "Don't, I can't. Emma, look at me. Look at me." Will kept his voice calm, steady, even though his own heart was pounding. "You're safe. He's not here. You're safe." She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand. He'll come back. He always comes back. He said if I ran, he'd find me. He'd make me watch him kill whoever helped me. He'd make me watch, and then he'd—" Her words dissolved into sobs. Will stood frozen, watching her fall apart, every instinct screaming at him to do something, fix this, make it stop. But he'd learned enough in the past 3 weeks to know that sometimes the best thing you could do for someone was give them space to break. So he waited. Eventually, Emma's sobs quieted. She sank down onto the ground, hugging her knees, her whole body trembling. Will crouched a few feet away, close enough that she could reach him if she wanted, far enough that she didn't feel trapped. "His name is Jacob," she said finally, her voice raw. "Jacob Sawyer. He took me from Tucson 4 months ago. I was working at the mercantile. He came in asking about supplies, and I helped him. And the next day I was walking home and—" She closed her eyes. "I woke up in a wagon. There were 2 other girls with me. We were tied and gagged, and they drove us for days. I don't even know where. Some camp in the middle of nowhere." "What happened to the other girls?" Will asked quietly. "He sold them. To men who came with money and didn't ask questions. But me," her voice cracked, "I fought back, tried to escape, so he kept me, said I needed to learn my place. He branded me like an animal, and—" She couldn't finish. Will's hands clenched so tight his knuckles went white. "How did you get away?" "I didn't. He got tired of me. Said I was too much trouble. So he had his men tie me up and leave me to die. Told them to make it look like a suicide so if anyone found me, they wouldn't come looking." Emma looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "You weren't supposed to cut me down. I was supposed to die." "Well, I did cut you down," Will said. "And you didn't die. And now he's going to answer for what he did to you. You can't—" "I'm not asking your permission, Emma. I'm telling you what's going to happen." He stood and held out his hand. "Come on, let's get you inside." She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. They walked back to the house in silence, and Will settled her in the chair by the stove with a blanket and a cup of tea she didn't drink. Then he went outside and stood on the porch, staring out at the land, his mind working. Jacob Sawyer was still out there, still taking girls, still destroying lives. And if the hoof prints Will had found meant what he thought they meant, Sawyer knew Emma was alive, which meant he'd be coming back to finish what he started. Will went to the barn and opened the trunk where he kept his old deputy gear. The badge was tarnished, the leather holster cracked with age, but the second revolver was clean and well-oiled. He strapped it on, checked the ammunition, and carried both rifles back to the house. He spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the doors, checking the windows, making sure every entrance could be defended. Emma watched him work without speaking. Finally, as the sun began to set, she said, "You're preparing for a fight. I'm preparing to keep you safe. This isn't your fight, Will." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "Yes, it is." "Why?" "Because you found me. Because you feel responsible." "No." He crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair so they were eye to eye. "Because you matter. Because what happened to you was wrong. And because I'll be damned if I let it happen again." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want you to die because of me. I don't plan on dying. Jacob's not alone. He has men, at least 4 that I saw, maybe more. They're armed and they're mean and they'll kill you without thinking twice. Let them try. She grabbed his arm, her grip desperate. You don't understand what he's like. He's not just cruel, he's smart. He plans everything. If he knows I'm alive, he won't just ride up to your door. He'll wait. He'll watch. He'll find your weakness, and he'll use it. Then I'll be ready. Emma shook her head, fresh tears spilling over. You can't be ready for someone like him. But Will just squeezed her hand and said, watch me. That night they ate dinner by lamplight, and afterward Will taught Emma how to load and fire the old Colt revolver he'd given her. She was a terrible shot, at first flinching every time she pulled the trigger, but she kept at it until she could hit the fence post more often than not. Good, Will said. If anyone comes through that door that isn't me, you shoot first and ask questions later. Understand? I understand. They went inside and Will locked the door behind them, sliding the heavy wooden bar into place. He positioned himself in the chair with a clear view of both the front door and the window. Emma sat on the floor nearby, the revolver in her lap, her eyes on the darkness outside. Tell me about Tucson, Will said after a while. Before all this, what was it like? Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, loud, dusty, full of people who all seemed to be rushing somewhere. I lived with my aunt after my parents died. She ran the mercantile. I helped her with inventory and customers. A small smile touched her lips. There was this boy who used to come in every Saturday to buy peppermints. He was so nervous he could barely speak. Used to turn bright red whenever I looked at him. You ever talked to him? Once. Told him the peppermints were on sale. He bought 6 months' worth and never came back. She laughed softly. I think I scared him. You probably did. They talked through the night, trading stories, hers about Tucson, his about his years as a deputy. He told her about the time he arrested a man for stealing a pig, and the pig ended up escaping the impound and wreaking havoc through the entire town. She told him about the traveling magician who came through Tucson and accidentally set his own wagon on fire during a performance. They laughed, and for a few hours the fear receded, and they were just two people sharing space in the darkness. But when dawn came, the fear returned. Will saw them as soon as the sun cleared the horizon. 4 riders silhouetted against the pink sky, sitting motionless on the ridge 1/2 mile from the house. Too far to see their faces, but close enough to send a message. We know you're here. Emma saw them too. She went rigid beside him, her hand flying to the revolver at her hip. Is that them? Will asked. I don't know. Maybe. I can't see. Her voice broke. Oh, God. Get inside, Will said. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. What are you going to do? Going to have a conversation. Will know. But he was already moving. He grabbed his rifle, checked his revolvers, and headed for the barn. Emma's voice followed him, desperate and afraid, but he didn't turn back. He saddled his horse with quick, practiced movements, swung up into the saddle, and rode toward the ridge. The 4 men didn't move as he approached. They just sat there, watching their faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats. Will stopped his horse about 30 yards away and called out, This is private property. You're trespassing. One of the men urged his horse forward a few steps. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard shot through with gray. His eyes were cold as river stones. Name's Dutch, the man said. We're looking for something that belongs to our boss. Nothing here belongs to you or your boss. Dutch smiled, but there was no humor in it. Now that's where you're wrong, friend. We had a girl. She ran off, and we have reason to believe she's here. Don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Dutch's smile widened. We've been watching. Saw her hanging laundry yesterday. Pretty little thing, dark hair. Looks like she's recovering nicely from her accident. Will's jaw tightened. Leave. Now. Can't do that. See the girl's valuable property, and my boss doesn't like when his property gets damaged or stolen. So we're going to need you to hand her over, and then we'll be on our way. That's not happening. Then we have a problem. Dutch's hand drifted toward the gun at his hip. You seem like a reasonable man. Hate to see you die over something that's not your concern. Everything on this ranch is my concern. Is that right? Dutch looked past Will toward the house. Well then, guess we'll have to come back when you're not around. You set foot on this property again, I'll kill you, Dutch laughed. Big words from one man against 4. Try me. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Dutch pulled his reins and turned his horse. "We'll be seeing you, friend." The four riders disappeared over the ridge, but Will knew they weren't gone. They were circling, watching, waiting for an opening. He rode back to the house and found Emma standing on the porch, her face white as chalk. "They're going to come back," she said. "I know. We should run. Leave tonight. Go somewhere he can't find us." Will dismounted and climbed the porch steps. "I'm not running. This is my land, my home, and nobody's taking it from me. Nobody's taking you from me." Emma's eyes were desperate. "Then what do we do?" Will looked out at the horizon where the riders had disappeared. His voice was hard as iron when he spoke. "We get ready for war." Will spent the rest of that morning turning his ranch into a fortress. He reinforced the barn doors with extra planks, positioned water barrels around the house in case of fire, and cleared sight lines so nothing could approach without being seen. Emma worked beside him without being asked, her movements quick and efficient, despite the fear he could see etched into every line of her body. She'd stopped arguing about running. Maybe she understood that running wouldn't solve anything. Maybe she was just too tired to fight anymore. By noon, the sun was brutal overhead, and sweat soaked through Will's shirt. He was hammering the last board into place on the barn door when Emma appeared with a dipper of water. He drank it gratefully, then poured the rest over his head. "How many rounds do we have?" Emma asked. Will wiped his face with his sleeve. "Enough for a fight, not enough for a siege. What if they wait us out? What if they just sit out there until we run out of food or water?" "They won't wait. Men like that don't have patience." Will set the hammer down and looked at her. "They'll come tonight or tomorrow night. Soon. Before we have time to get help or fortify further. They'll want this finished quick." Emma's hand went to the revolver at her hip, a gesture that was already becoming habit. "I can shoot. Not well, but I can shoot." "I know. But I don't want you shooting unless you have to. I want you in the house with the door barred. If they get past me, you use that gun. Otherwise, you stay hidden." "And what if they get past you?" "They won't." They won't." He repeated, his voice harder this time. "I've been in situations like this before. I know how men like Dutch think, how they move. They'll come fast and loud, thinking they can scare us into submission. But we have the advantage. We know the land, we know the house, and we know they're coming. That's more than enough." Emma didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. They finished the preparations in silence, and when there was nothing left to do, they went inside and waited. Will positioned himself at the window with his rifle, while Emma sat at the table cleaning the revolver for the third time. The house was hot, and still the only sound the tick of the clock on the mantel and the occasional creak of wood settling. Around 3 in the afternoon, Emma spoke. "Tell me about the worst fight you were ever in, when you were a deputy." Will didn't take his eyes off the window. "Why?" "Because I need to know you've survived something like this before. I need to believe you'll survive it again." He was quiet for a long moment, remembering. "It was in a mining town called Silver Creek. I was transporting a prisoner to Tucson for trial, a man named Curtis Reed. He'd killed 3 people in a robbery, and his brothers wanted him back. They ambushed us 10 miles outside of town. 5 of them against me and my partner. What happened? My partner took a bullet in the first volley, went down before he could even draw. The Reed brothers thought that was it, thought I'd surrender. But I had cover behind a rock formation and a rifle with a full magazine. I held them off for 6 hours, killed 2 of them, wounded another. The rest finally gave up when they realized Curtis wasn't worth dying for." "And your partner?" "He lived, carried him back to town and got him to a doctor. He was laid up for 3 months, but he made it." Will glanced at her. "The point is, I've been outnumbered before. I've been outgunned before. And I'm still here." Emma absorbed this, her fingers still working the cloth over the revolver's cylinder. "Were you scared?" "Terrified." "But you didn't run." "No." "Why not?" Will turned to look at her fully. "Because running meant letting Curtis Reed go free, meant letting his brothers win, meant all those people he killed died for nothing. I couldn't live with that." Emma's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Is that what this is? You can't live with letting them win." "That's part of it." "What's the other part?" He held her gaze. "You." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Neither of them was quite ready to name. Emma looked away first, her cheeks flushed, and went back to cleaning the gun she'd already cleaned twice before. Will returned his attention to the window, but something had shifted in the room, something fragile and new. The afternoon dragged into evening. Will made coffee, and Emma heated up the stew she'd prepared that morning. They ate quickly, mechanically, neither tasting the food. When darkness finally fell, Will lit a single lamp and positioned it away from the windows so the light wouldn't silhouette them. Then he settled back into his chair with the rifle across his knees and waited. Emma dozed fitfully at the table, her head pillowed on her arms, the revolver within easy reach. Will watched her sleep and felt something tighten in his chest. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a stranger dying in a burlap sack. Now, she was the reason he was preparing to fight 4 armed men. When had that happened? When had she stopped being someone he was helping and started being someone he couldn't imagine losing? He didn't have an answer. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe some things just happened without reason or logic, like storms or sunrises. Around midnight, he heard it. The soft crunch of boots on gravel. Will's hand tightened on the rifle. He leaned close to the window, peering through the gap in the curtain. At first he saw nothing, then movement near the barn, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows moving low and fast. They were here. He crossed to the table and touched Emma's shoulder. She woke instantly, her hand going to the gun. "They're outside," Will whispered. "Get in the bedroom. Bar the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear." Emma's face was pale but determined. She stood, grabbed the revolver, and moved toward the bedroom. Then she stopped and turned back. "Will?" "Yeah." "Don't die." He almost smiled. "I'll do my best." She disappeared into the bedroom, and he heard the scrape of the bar sliding into place. Good. Now he could focus on what was coming. Will moved to the far corner of the room, where he had a clear view of both the front door and the window. He checked his revolvers one last time, made sure the rifle was loaded, and steadied his breathing. The waiting was always the worst part. The moment before violence, when your mind played out 100 different scenarios, none of them good. The first shot shattered the window. Glass exploded inward, and the lamp on the far side of the room erupted in flame. Will dropped flat as 2 more shots punched through the door. So much for them being smart about this. They were going loud and aggressive, trying to flush him out through fear and chaos. It wouldn't work. Will crawled to the window and fired 3 quick shots into the darkness. He heard a grunt of pain and someone cursed. One down, or at least wounded. He rolled away from the window as return fire tore through the walls, splinters raining down around him. The front door shuddered under impact as someone tried to kick it in. Will fired twice through the door and was rewarded with a scream. The kicking stopped. "We can do this all night, old man." Dutch's voice came from outside, hoarse and angry. "Just send out the girl, and nobody else has to die." Will didn't waste breath on a response. He reloaded the rifle and moved to a different position. Never stay in one place. That was the first rule of surviving a gunfight. The moment you became predictable was the moment you became dead. Something crashed through the back window. Will spun and saw the oil lamp an instant before it shattered against the floor flames, spreading fast across the old dry wood. Damn it! They were trying to burn him out. He grabbed the nearest water bucket and doused the flames before they could catch, then fired blind through the broken window. The answering shots went high, punching through the ceiling. Emma's voice came from the bedroom, scared and muffled by the door. "Stay where you are," he shouted back. More shots. The front door was taking a beating now, the wood beginning to splinter around the bar. Will knew he couldn't hold it forever. Eventually they'd breach one entrance or another, and then it would become close quarters fighting, 4 against 1 in the dark. Not good odds. But Will Morgan had survived on not good odds before. He moved to the kitchen and grabbed the second rifle he'd positioned there, along with the box of ammunition. Then he did something they wouldn't expect. He went to the front door, pulled back the bar, and kicked it open. The man on the other side barely had time to look surprised before Will's rifle spoke. He went down hard. Will stepped over him onto the porch and fired into the darkness, methodical and precise. Muzzle flash lit up the night in strobe bursts. He saw Dutch diving for cover behind a water trough, saw another man stumbling with blood on his shirt, saw the third one raising a shotgun. Will dropped flat as the shotgun roared. The shot went over his head and he heard it tear through the wall behind him. He rolled, came up on one knee, and put 2 rounds into the man with the shotgun. The man dropped like a puppet with cut strings. 2 down. Maybe 3 if the one he'd shot through the door was out of the fight. Dutch was shouting something, but Will couldn't make out the words over the ringing in his ears. He retreated back into the house, slammed the door, and threw the bar back in place. His shoulder burned where he'd hit the porch wrong, and his hands were shaking from adrenaline. He did a quick check. No hits, nothing bleeding, just bruises and ringing ears. The shooting had stopped. Will moved to the window and peered out carefully. The yard was empty except for the bodies. No movement. No sound except the distant howl of coyotes and his own harsh breathing. Will... Emma's voice, again desperate now. "I'm okay," he called back. "Stay put." He waited 5 minutes. 10. Nothing moved outside. Were they regrouping, running? He didn't know, and he couldn't afford to assume. He kept his position rifle ready, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. Then he heard it. The sound of horses moving away fast and urgent. He risked a longer look through the window and saw 2 riders disappearing into the night, one of them slumped in the saddle. They were running. Dutch, and whoever else was left, had decided the girl wasn't worth losing any more men. Will waited another 15 minutes to be sure. Then he moved through the house, checking every window, every door, making sure no one had stayed behind. When he was satisfied they were really gone, he went to the bedroom and knocked. "Emma, it's over. You can come out." The bar scraped back and the door opened. Emma stood there with the revolver raised, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. When she saw him standing there alive and whole, something broke in her expression. She lowered the gun and threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "I thought when I heard all those shots, I thought, I'm fine," Will said quietly, wrapping his arms around her. "I'm fine." She was crying now, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Will held her and let her cry, one hand stroking her hair, feeling the tremors run through her. When she finally quieted, he pulled back just enough to look at her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, just scared." "That's over now. They're gone." "You don't know that. They could come back. They're not coming back. Not tonight." Will guided her to the chair and made her sit. "Wait here. I need to check something." He took one of the lamps and went outside. The night air was cool and clean after the smoke and gunpowder. He approached the first body, carefully rifle ready, but the man was dead. Shot through the chest. The second body was the one from the porch, also dead. Will searched them both, looking for anything that might tell him where Dutch and the others would go, but found nothing except a few coins and some ammunition. He dragged both bodies away from the house and covered them with canvas. He'd deal with them properly in the morning. For now, he just wanted them out of sight. When he came back inside, Emma was still in the chair staring at nothing. 2 dead, Will said. 2 got away, Dutch and 1 other. "Will he come back?" "Not tonight, maybe not ever. I hit the other man pretty bad. They'll need time to regroup 10 wounds, and now they know we're not easy targets." Emma looked up at him. "What about the law?" "Shouldn't we tell the sheriff?" "We will. First light, I'll ride into town and report what happened. They'll send someone to collect the bodies and maybe put together a posse to track Dutch." Will sat down across from her. "But Emma, they're going to ask questions about why these men came here. About you." Her face went pale again. "I know." "You don't have to tell them everything, just enough that they understand what happened." "What if they don't believe me?" "They'll believe you. You have the brand. You have the scars. And we have 2 dead men outside who came here trying to take you by force." Will leaned forward. "Nobody's going to doubt your story." Emma nodded slowly. Then she said, "What happens after you tell the sheriff, after they chase Dutch?" "We rebuild, fix the damage, get back to normal." "Normal?" Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't even know what that means anymore." Will reached across and took her hand. "It means you're safe. It means you don't have to run or hide. It means you can wake up in the morning without being afraid." "Will that ever really happen? Will I ever really feel safe again?" "Yes," Will said with a certainty he didn't entirely feel. "It just takes time." They sat like that for a while, hands clasped across the table, neither speaking. The house was a wreck around them. Bullet holes in the walls, broken glass everywhere, smoke stains on the ceiling, but they were alive. That was what mattered. Eventually, Emma spoke again. "Thank you. for fighting for me, for not giving up. You don't need to thank me. Yes, I do. You could have let them take me. Would have been easier, safer. Easier isn't always right. Emma smiled, then small and fragile. Sarah was lucky to have you. I was the lucky one. Will? Yeah? I'm glad you found me, even though it brought all this trouble, even though it put you in danger. I'm glad. Will squeezed her hand. Me too. They spent the rest of the night cleaning up what they could and taking turns keeping watch, though Will suspected neither of them would have slept even if they'd tried. When dawn finally broke pale and gray, Will saddled his horse and prepared to ride into town. Emma insisted on coming with him. You shouldn't be alone out here, she said. Not until we know for sure they're gone. Will wanted to argue, but he knew she was right, so they rode together side by side as the sun climbed higher and turned the desert gold. The town came into view around mid-morning, looking exactly the same as it always did, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Will could feel it in his bones. Sheriff Garrett was just opening the office when they arrived. He took one look at Will's face and said, "What happened?" Will told him. All of it. Garrett listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every word. When Will finished, the sheriff sat back in his chair and rubbed his face. Jesus Christ, you killed 2 of them. Self-defense, they came at night, shot up my house, tried to burn us out. And the girl, she can corroborate. Will looked at Emma. She nodded. Garrett studied her for a long moment. Then he said, I need you to tell me everything you remember, about Jacob Sawyer, about his operation, about where he kept you. Anything that might help us find him. Emma's jaw tightened, but she nodded again. Okay. It took 2 hours. Emma spoke slowly, haltingly, sometimes having to stop when the memories became too much. She described the camp where they'd held her somewhere in the mountains east of Bisbee. She described the other girls, the men who came to buy them, the layout of the operation. She described Jacob Sawyer in detail, his voice, his mannerisms, the way he moved. Every word was clearly costing her, but she kept going, determined to see it through. When she finished, Garrett had pages of notes. He looked up at her with something like respect in his eyes. You're brave, he said simply. Most people wouldn't have survived what you went through. Fewer still would have the courage to testify about it. I'm not brave, Emma said quietly. I'm just angry. Good. Anger's useful, keeps you sharp. Garrett turned to Will. I'm going to organize a posse. With what Miss Emma's told us, we should be able to find Sawyer's camp, but it'll take a few days to get men together. I'm going with you, Will said. Will sub. I'm going. Non-negotiable. Garrett sighed but didn't argue. He knew that look. Fine. But you follow my lead. This is law business now, not revenge business. Understood. They left the office and stepped out into the bright sunlight. Emma was quiet, her face drawn with exhaustion. Will wanted to take her straight home, but there was one more stop he needed to make. The general store was busy with mid-morning shoppers. Will found Fletcher behind the counter and pulled him aside. I need supplies, Will said. Ammunition, food, medical supplies. Everything you've got. Fletcher raised his eyebrows. Planning a war. Already had one. Preparing for another. Fletcher didn't ask questions. He just started pulling items from the shelves. While he worked, Emma wandered the store, running her fingers over bolts of fabric, picking up small items and setting them down again. Will watched her and felt that tightness in his chest again. She looked lost, like she was trying to remember what normal people did in normal places. He walked over to her. You see anything you want? She looked up at him, startled. What? Anything in the store? Something for yourself? Emma shook her head. I don't need anything. That's not what I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she pointed to a shelf of books. I used to like reading. Before. Will walked over and pulled down 3 books without checking the titles. He carried them to the counter and added them to his order. Fletcher gave him a knowing look but said nothing. On the ride back to the ranch, Emma held the books in her lap like they were precious things. She kept touching the covers, tracing the embossed letters with her fingertips. Thank you, she said quietly. You're welcome. Nobody's given me anything in a long time, not without wanting something in return. I don't want anything except to see you happy." Emma looked at him, then really looked at him, and Will saw something in her eyes he'd been hoping to see. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of it, the possibility. They spent the rest of that day and the next repairing the damage to the house. Will replaced the broken windows, patched the bullet holes, fixed the splintered door. Emma helped where she could, handing him tools, holding boards steady. They worked in comfortable silence, falling into a rhythm that felt natural and right. On the third day, Sheriff Garrett arrived with 5 men. They were all deputies or former lawmen, hard-eyed and capable. Garrett introduced them briefly, then got down to business. "We ride at first light tomorrow. Based on what Miss Emma described, the camp should be about 2 days northeast. We'll approach at night, surround them, and give them a chance to surrender. If they don't, we take them by force." "What about the girls?" one of the deputies asked. "If there are more being held there, that's why we're bringing the wagon, for transporting survivors." Garrett looked at each man in turn. "This won't be easy. These are dangerous men who have nothing to lose. Some of you might not come back. Anyone want to back out? Now's the time." Nobody moved. Garrett nodded. "Good. Get your affairs in order. Say your goodbyes. We leave at dawn." That evening, Will sat on the porch with Emma watching the sun go down. Neither of them had spoken much since Garrett left. There wasn't much to say. They both knew what tomorrow meant. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "What if something happens to you out there?" "Nothing's going to happen." "You don't know that." "No," Will admitted. "I don't, but I'm not going to lie to you and pretend this isn't dangerous. It is, but it's necessary." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "If you don't come back, I won't know what to do. I won't know how to—" Her voice broke. Will turned to face her. "If I don't come back, you keep living. You take care of this place. You read those books. You find something that makes you happy. You don't let what happened to you define who you are. You hear me?" Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "And Emma, if I do come back, and I will, I want you to know something." "What?" Will reached out and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. "These past few weeks, having you here, seeing you get stronger every day, it's reminded me what it feels like to have something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. So when I ride out tomorrow, I'm not just fighting for justice or the law or those other girls. I'm fighting to come back here. To you." Emma's breath caught. "Will, you don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. They stayed like that as darkness fell around them, 2 souls finding comfort in proximity, in the simple act of not being alone. That night, Will lay awake in his chair, watching Emma sleep in the next room. He thought about Sarah, about the life they'd had, and the life they'd never get to live. He thought about justice and revenge, and the thin line between them. Mostly, he thought about tomorrow, about riding into unknown danger with 5 men he barely knew, chasing a monster who'd already proven he was capable of anything. But for the first time in 3 years, Will Morgan felt like his life had purpose again. Like there was something worth surviving for. Whatever happened tomorrow, that would have to be enough. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning that made a man's bones ache. Will was already dressed and checking his gear when Emma emerged from the bedroom. Her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes red from a sleepless night. She watched him in silence as he loaded his rifles, checked his ammunition strapped on his revolvers. Every movement was deliberate, practiced the muscle memory of a man who'd done this before. "You should eat something," Emma said finally. "Not hungry." "Will." He looked up at her and saw the fear she was trying so hard to hide. He set down the rifle and crossed to where she stood. "I'll eat," he said quietly, "if you eat with me." She nodded and moved to the stove where she'd already started coffee. They ate in silence, neither tasting the food, both acutely aware that this might be the last morning they shared. Outside, the sound of horses approaching broke the stillness. The posse had arrived. Will stood and gathered his weapons. Emma followed him to the door, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. On the porch, Sheriff Garrett sat astride his horse, flanked by the 5 deputies. They looked grim and ready men who understood what they were riding toward. "Time to go," Garrett said. Will turned to Emma. For a moment he couldn't find words. Then he simply pulled her close and held her, feeling her heart beat against his chest, memorizing the way she fit in his arms. "Come back," she whispered against his shoulder. "I will. Promise me." "I promise." He pulled back, looked into her eyes one last time, then mounted his horse. Emma stood on the porch watching as the 7 riders moved out, and Will forced himself not to look back. Looking back was bad luck. Looking back meant doubt. He needed to ride forward with certainty, with the absolute belief that he would survive this and return to her. The posse rode northeast through country that grew increasingly rough and wild. They passed through stands of juniper and mesquite, climbed rocky inclines where the horses struggled for footing, descended into dry washes that wound between steep canyon walls. Garrett set a hard pace, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and check their position against the landmarks Emma had described. By late afternoon, they reached the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. The land here was harsh and unforgiving, all jagged rock and sparse vegetation. Perfect country for men who didn't want to be found. They made camp in a narrow canyon as the sun set, building no fire, eating cold rations in silence. The deputies checked their weapons and spoke in low voices about what tomorrow might bring. Will sat apart his back against a boulder, watching the stars emerge one by one. Garrett came and sat beside him. "You nervous?" the sheriff asked. "Always am before something like this." "That's good. Keeps you sharp." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said. About the girl. Emma." Will looked at him. "What about her?" "You care about her." "I do." "More than just someone you helped?" Will didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Yeah, more than that." Garrett nodded slowly. "Just want to make sure your head's in the right place tomorrow. Can't afford to have you thinking about getting back to her instead of staying alive long enough to get back to her. You understand the difference?" "I understand." "Good. Because I need you focused. These men we're going after, they're not going to hesitate. They'll kill you without blinking if you give them the chance." "I know what they are." "Do you because knowing and understanding are different things? I've seen good men die because they underestimated the enemy, thought they could appeal to some humanity that wasn't there." Garrett's voice hardened. "Jacob Sawyer isn't human anymore. He's something else, something that needs to be put down like a rabid dog. You need to accept that before we ride in there." Will met his gaze steadily. "I accepted that the moment I saw what he did to Emma." They rode out before dawn, leaving the horses tied a mile from where Emma had said the camp would be. They would approach on foot, quiet and careful, using the darkness and terrain for cover. Garrett had studied Emma's description of the camp layout carefully and had a plan. They would split into 2 groups, surround the camp from opposite sides, and move in at first light when the men would be groggy and off guard. Will was assigned to Garrett's group along with 2 deputies named Carson and Blake. The other 3 would approach from the east under the command of a former Army scout named Reeves. They synchronized their pocket watches and agreed on signals. Then they split up and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. Moving through the mountains in the dark was treacherous work. More than once, Will felt loose rock shift under his boots, heard the rattle of stones tumbling down the slope below. Every sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. But they moved slowly, carefully, and after 2 hours of climbing, they reached the ridge overlooking the canyon Emma had described. Will crouched behind a boulder and looked down. There it was. The camp sat in a bowl-shaped depression sheltered on 3 sides by steep rock walls. A dozen rough structures made of canvas and scrap wood clustered around a central fire pit. Even in the dim light before dawn, Will could see movement. Someone was up, tending to something near one of the larger tents. Garrett pulled out his field glasses and studied the scene. "I count 5 structures. 4 look like sleeping quarters, one's probably storage or a cook area. I don't see any lookouts posted." "Overconfident," Carson muttered. "Stupid." "Or they don't think anyone knows they're here," Blake added. Will's jaw tightened. How many girls had they brought through this camp? How many lives had been destroyed in these shabby tents? He thought of Emma, of what she'd endured here, and felt his hands clench on his rifle. They waited as the skies slowly lightened from black to gray to pale blue. The camp below stirred to life. Men emerged from the tents, stretching and scratching. Will counted 6, then 7. No sign of Dutch or Jacob Sawyer yet. Where were they? Garrett checked his watch. 5 minutes. Reeves and his men should be in position. The minutes crawled by. Will's heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth was dry. Every sense was heightened, every nerve alive. This was the moment before violence, the suspended breath before the storm broke. He'd been here before, but it never got easier. A bird called from across the canyon. Garrett's signal. Go, the sheriff whispered. They moved down the slope, rifles ready, picking their way between boulders and scrub brush. Below them, the camp was fully awake now. Men stood around the fire pit drinking coffee. One was splitting wood. Another was examining a wagon that looked like it had seen hard use. Nobody was looking up. Nobody suspected. They were 50 yards out when someone in the camp shouted. Will didn't know if they'd been spotted or if something else had triggered the alarm, but suddenly men were scrambling for weapons and diving for cover. Garrett cursed and broke into a run. Will and the deputies followed, abandoning stealth for speed. "This is the law," Garrett shouted. "Throw down your weapons. You're under arrest." The response was immediate gunfire. Bullets whined past Will's head and spanged off rocks around him. He dropped behind a boulder and returned fire, his shots measured and precise. Beside him, Carson grunted and felt blood spreading across his shoulder. Blake grabbed him and dragged him to cover. From the opposite side of the camp came more shooting. Reeves and his men had engaged. The camp was now caught in a crossfire exactly as Garrett had planned. But the men weren't surrendering. They were fighting like cornered animals, desperate and vicious. Will saw a man break from cover running for the wagon. Will led him and fired. The man went down hard. Another emerged from a tent, shotgun raised. Blake shot him before he could pull the trigger. The air filled with smoke and noise and confusion. "The tents!" Garrett was shouting. "Check the tents for prisoners!" Will nodded and broke from cover, sprinting toward the nearest structure. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet, but he didn't slow. He hit the tent entrance at a run, rifle raised ready for anything. Inside was darkness and the smell of fear. His eyes adjusted, and he saw her. A girl maybe 16 chained to a support pole. Her dress was torn and filthy, her face bruised. She stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. "It's okay, Will said quickly. "I'm here to help. Are there others?" She nodded, frantically pointing to the tent next door. Will moved back outside where the shooting had lessened. Most of the men were either down or had fled into the rocks. He ran to the second tent and pushed inside. 2 more girls. Both younger than Emma. Both chained. Both looking at him like they couldn't quite believe he was real. "We're getting you out," Will said. He used his knife to work at the chains, cursing the heavy locks. "Where are the keys?" "He has them," one of the girls whispered. "The boss, Jacob." "Where is he?" "He left yesterday, went to town, said he'd be back tonight." Will's stomach sank. Sawyer wasn't here. All this and the man they really wanted had escaped. He managed to break the chains using the butt of his rifle as a hammer against the lock mechanisms. The girls stumbled out of the tent, blinking in the bright morning light. Garrett was there, his face grim, directing his men to search the remaining structures. "Find anyone else?" Will asked. "One more. Reeves is bringing her out now." Garrett looked at the 3 girls standing shell-shocked in the center of the camp. 4 girls, Jesus Christ. "Sawyer's not here. He went to town yesterday." Garrett's expression darkened. "Which town?" "They didn't say." A deputy named Morrison appeared from behind one of the tents, half carrying a man who'd been shot in the leg. "This one's talking. Says there's another camp. Bigger one. Says Sawyer runs the whole operation from there." "Where?" Garrett demanded. The wounded man spat blood. "Go to hell." Garrett grabbed him by his shirt. "You're going to hang for this. Only question is whether it's quick or slow. Tell me where Sawyer is, and I'll make sure it's quick." The man laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. "You think you scare me? You don't know what Jacob does to snitches. I'll take the rope." Will stepped forward. He crouched down so he was eye level with the wounded man. When he spoke, his voice was low and cold. You're right. We don't scare you, but let me tell you what's going to happen. We're going to find Jacob Sawyer, with or without your help. And when we do, we're going to tell him you talked. We're going to make sure he knows every detail came from you, and then before we put him down, we're going to let him know exactly who betrayed him." The man's face went pale. "You wouldn't. Try me." For a long moment they stared at each other. Then the man's resolve crumbled. "San Simon Valley. There's an old mission there. Abandoned. That's where he runs things. But it's fortified. He's got at least a dozen men. You'll never take it." "We'll see about that." Garrett ordered his men to secure the prisoners and tend to Carson's wound. The girls were given water and blankets and loaded into the wagon. They sat huddled together, not speaking, just staring at nothing. Will recognized that look. Emma had worn it for weeks. They burned the camp. Garrett said it was to destroy evidence, but Will suspected it was more than that. It was about erasing a place of horror, about making sure nobody could ever use these tents for the same purpose again. They stood and watched the flames climb into the clear morning sky, black smoke marking the spot where evil had lived. The ride back was slower with the wagon and the prisoners. They reached Tombstone late the next day. The town gathered to see them arrive, word having spread about the rescue. Women wept at the sight of the girls. Men shouted for the prisoners to be hanged right there. Garrett had to post guards on the jail to keep the crowd from taking matters into their own hands. The doctor examined the girls while Garrett wrote his report. Will stood outside the doctor's office waiting, thinking about Emma and wondering how she was managing alone at the ranch. He wanted to ride home immediately, but Garrett needed him to give a statement. So he waited, patience worn thin, until finally the sheriff emerged. "The girls will be all right," Garrett said. "Physically anyway. Mentally." He shook his head. "That's going to take time. Maybe forever." "What about Sawyer?" "I'm sending a telegram to the territorial marshal. This is bigger than anything my office can handle, but I'll need a day to organize another posse. Men, supplies, ammunition. That mission is going to be a fortress. We can't go in half-cocked." "How long?" 3 days. Maybe 4. Will shook his head. "That's too long. He'll hear about what happened here. He'll run." "Maybe, but I'm not getting more men killed by rushing in unprepared." Will wanted to argue, but he knew Garrett was right. So he gave his statement, signed the paperwork, and finally, as the sun was setting, he mounted his horse and rode for home. The ranch appeared out of the gathering darkness like a promise kept. Lamplight glowed in the windows, smoke rose from the chimney, and on the porch, silhouetted against the light, stood Emma. She must have been watching the road, because the moment she saw him, she ran down the steps. Will dismounted, and she crashed into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her face buried in his chest. He held her tight, feeling her tears soak through his shirt, feeling his own eyes burn. "You came back," she said over and over. "You came back." "I promised." She pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands framing his face. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine." "The others?" "One wounded, none dead. We found 4 girls, Emma. 4 more like you. We saved them." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Thank God." They went inside, and Emma made him sit while she heated water for washing and prepared food he was finally hungry enough to eat. He told her everything, about the camp, about the rescue, about the wounded man's confession. When he mentioned that Sawyer hadn't been there, her face fell. "So he's still out there?" "For now. But Garrett knows where he is. We're going after him in a few days." "You're going after him?" Emma corrected. "Well, you don't have to. You've done enough. It's not about enough. It's about finishing this. And what if you don't come back next time? What if—" "Emma." He reached across the table and took her hands. "I need to do this, not just for you. For all the girls he's hurt. For the ones he'll hurt if we don't stop him. Can you understand that—" She was quiet for a long time, then she nodded. "Yes, but I don't have to like it." "No, you don't." That night, Will slept in his chair like always, but he woke in the dark hours before dawn to find Emma standing beside him. She was wearing her nightgown, her hair loose, her expression uncertain. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I keep thinking about what happens after you catch Jacob, after this is all over. What about it? What happens to me? Do I go back to Tucson? Try to find my aunt, start over somewhere new. Will sat up slowly. Is that what you want? I don't know what I want. I just know I don't want to lose this. This place, this feeling of being safe. She hesitated. You. The word hung in the air between them. Will stood and moved closer to her, close enough that he could see the lamplight reflected in her eyes. You don't have to go anywhere, he said quietly. You can stay here, long as you want. As what, your charity case, the broken girl you took in? No, as Emma. As the woman who fixed up my house and learned to split wood and made this place feel like a home again. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. As the woman I'm falling in love with. Her breath caught. Will, you don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. Whatever happens in the next few days, I needed you to know that. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. You foolish, brave, impossible man. Then she kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, testing, asking permission. Will answered by pulling her closer, deepening the kiss, pouring 3 weeks of longing and fear and hope into that single moment. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. I don't know if I can love anyone again, Emma whispered. Not after what happened, not after what I've become. You haven't become anything except stronger, and I'm not asking you to love me, not now, maybe not ever. I'm just asking you to stay, to give yourself time to heal, to see what's possible. She rested her forehead against his chest. I'll try. That's all I'm asking. They stood like that until the first light of dawn crept through the windows, two damaged souls finding comfort in each other, finding hope in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could build something good from all this wreckage. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended state. Will worked the ranch repairing fences and tending cattle. Emma cooked and cleaned and slowly began claiming spaces in the house as her own. She moved her few belongings into the bedroom, hung her clothes in the wardrobe Sarah had used. Will watched this transformation and felt something shift in his chest. The house was becoming theirs instead of his. The distinction mattered more than he'd expected. On the third evening, Garrett arrived with news. The posse was assembled. 20 men this time, including a contingent from the territorial marshal's office. They would ride at dawn and reach the mission by late afternoon. The plan was to surround it, demand surrender, and if that failed, take it by force. This is it, Garrett said. This is the end of Jacob Sawyer, one way or another. Will just nodded. That night, he and Emma sat on the porch watching stars wheel overhead. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered had already been said. When dawn came, Will dressed in silence. He strapped on his weapons, checked his ammunition one final time, and turned to find Emma watching him from the doorway. Come back to me, she said. I will. Promise. I promise. He kissed her once, long and deep, trying to memorize the taste of her, the feel of her in his arms. Then he pulled away and mounted his horse. Will, Emma called as he turned to leave. He looked back. When you find him, when you find Jacob Sawyer, you make sure he knows. You make sure he knows that I survived, that I'm free, that he didn't break me. Will's jaw tightened. I will. Then he rode out to meet the posse rode toward the old mission, and the final confrontation rode toward whatever destiny waited in the San Simon Valley. Behind him, Emma stood on the porch watching until he disappeared from sight, her hand pressed against her heart, her lips moving in silent prayer. The posse gathered at the edge of Tombstone as the sun broke over the mountains, 20 hard men on tired horses with grim purpose written on their faces. Will recognized a few from the first raid, but most were strangers. Marshall's men from Tucson and volunteers from neighboring ranches who'd heard about the missing girls. They all had their reasons for being here. Will's reason was waiting for him back at the ranch, praying he'd keep his promise. The territorial marshal was a man named Cole Brennan, tall and gray-haired with eyes that had seen too much. He gathered everyone in a circle before they rode out and laid down the law in a voice that brooked no argument. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. The mission is fortified and Sawyer will have lookouts posted. We approach from multiple directions, surround the place, and give them one chance to surrender. If they don't take it, we go in hard and fast. But nobody fires until I give the order. I won't have this turn into a massacre. We're lawmen, not executioners. One of the volunteers, a rancher named Hayes, whose daughter had gone missing 6 months prior, spat in the dust. What if some of us don't care about the distinction? Brennan fixed him with a cold stare. Then you can turn around right now. I understand your anger, but we do this legally or not at all. Jacob Sawyer will hang for what he's done. That's justice. Anything else is just revenge. Hayes held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. Nobody turned back. They rode south through country that grew increasingly desolate as the day wore on. The land here was all alkali flats and scattered mesquite shimmering with heat mirages that made distant mountains look like they were floating. Will rode near the front with Garrett and Brennan saying little thinking about Emma's final words. Make sure he knows that I survived. Make sure he knows he didn't break me. By late afternoon, they could see the mission rising from the valley floor like a broken tooth. It had been built by Spanish priests a century ago and abandoned when the Apache made the territory too dangerous. Now it served as a fortress for a different kind of predator. The walls were adobe 10 feet high in places with gaps where time and weather had taken their toll. A bell tower rose from the center, its cross long since fallen or stolen. Even from a distance, Will could see men moving on the walls. Brennan called a halt in a wash 2 miles out and spread a rough map on the ground. We split into 4 groups. Reeves, you take 5 men and approach from the east. Hayes, you and 4 others come in from the south. Garrett west side with your contingent. I'll take the north with the rest. We move into position over the next 2 hours quiet and careful. Nobody gets trigger happy. When everyone's in place, I ride up to the main gate under a white flag and make the offer. If they refuse, I fire 1 shot in the air. That's the signal. Everyone moves in. What about the girls? Will asked. If there are prisoners inside, they'll be caught in the crossfire. That's why we surround first. Give them nowhere to run. We make it clear that the only way anyone leaves is in custody or in a box. Most men will choose custody when faced with those odds. Most men aren't Jacob Sawyer. Brennan looked at him. You know him. I know what he's done. That's enough. The marshal nodded slowly. Then you understand why we have to end this today. They split up according to plan. Will was assigned to Garrett's western approach along with 3 other men. They circled wide using the terrain for cover, moving slowly through the scrub and rock. The sun was merciless overhead, and Will's canteen was half empty by the time they reached their position behind a low ridge overlooking the western wall. Through his field glasses, Will studied the mission. The walls were damaged, but still substantial with firing positions carved into the adobe at regular intervals. He counted at least 8 men visible, all armed, all alert. The main gate faced north toward where Brennan would approach. A smaller postern gate on the south side looked like it had been reinforced recently. They're ready for us, one of the deputies muttered. Probably heard about the raid on the camp. Garrett lowered his own glasses. Doesn't matter. They have nowhere to go. We've got them boxed. Time crawled. Will lay in the dirt watching the mission and thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. A sudden sally through the gates could break their line. Fire arrows could drive them back. Hostages could be brought out as shields. He'd seen desperate men do terrible things when cornered. Jacob Sawyer would be the most desperate of all. The sun was touching the western peaks when Marshal Brennan appeared on the north side. He rode slowly forward on a gray horse, a white cloth tied to his rifle barrel. Will tensed, watching the men on the walls. Would they respect the flag? Or would they shoot him down like a dog? They let him approach. Brennan stopped 50 yards from the gate and called out in a voice that carried across the valley. Jacob Sawyer, this is Marshal Cole Brennan, representing the territorial government. You're surrounded by 20 armed men. There's no escape. Send out any prisoners you're holding and surrender peacefully. You'll get a fair trial. Silence. Then a man appeared on the wall above the gate. Even from this distance, Will could see the scar running down his face. Jacob Sawyer, the man from the wanted poster, the man who'd branded Emma and left her to die. Marshal, Sawyer's voice was surprisingly cultured, almost pleasant. I appreciate the offer truly, but I'm afraid I must decline. This mission is my home, and I'm rather fond of it. As for prisoners, I don't know what you're talking about. Everyone here is free to leave whenever they choose. We know what you've done, Sawyer. We've rescued the girls from your camp. We have witnesses. It's over, Sawyer laughed. Witnesses can be unreliable. Memory is such a fragile thing. And as for my camp, I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Perhaps you've mistaken me for someone else. Last chance, surrender now, or we come in. Then I suppose you'll have to come in, won't you? Sawyer disappeared from the wall. Brennan waited a moment longer, then raised his rifle and fired once into the air. The signal. Will was moving before the echo faded. He and Garrett and the others charged the western wall, firing as they ran. The men on the walls returned fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. From 3 other directions came the sound of more shooting as the other groups advanced. The mission was under assault from all sides. Will reached the wall and pressed against it, breathing hard. Bullets chipped adobe above his head. Beside him, one of the deputies was loading his rifle with trembling hands. Garrett was shouting orders, but Will couldn't make out the words over the roar of gunfire. Then the gate exploded. Someone inside had packed black powder against the wooden barrier and lit it. The blast knocked Will flat and sent debris flying. Through the smoke and dust, he saw men pouring out of the breach, some running, some turning to fire back into the mission. The defensive line was collapsing. Will scrambled to his feet and charged through the opening. Inside the walls was chaos. Buildings burned. Men fought hand to hand. A woman screamed from somewhere to his left. Will spun and saw her, a girl no older than 15, being dragged across the courtyard by a man with a knife. Will didn't think. He raised his rifle and fired. The man dropped. The girl fell to her knees, sobbing. Will ran to her. "Can you walk?" She nodded frantically. "Then run. North Gate. Don't stop." She stumbled away and Will turned back to the fight. The mission courtyard was maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by low buildings that had once been monks' cells and were now storage or barracks. Sawyer's men were falling back to the bell tower in the center, making a final stand. Marshal Brennan was advancing with 10 men calling for surrender, but nobody was listening. The air stank of gunpowder and blood. Will saw Dutch. Then the man who'd come to his ranch, who'd threatened Emma, who'd killed 2 men trying to take her back. Dutch was limping, blood staining his leg, but he still had a pistol in his hand. Their eyes met across the courtyard. Recognition flared. Dutch raised his gun. Will was faster. He fired twice. Dutch staggered, looked down at the spreading red on his chest, then fell forward into the dust. Will felt nothing. No triumph, no regret. Just the cold certainty that one more monster was dead. The bell tower door slammed open and Jacob Sawyer emerged. He had a young girl in front of him, his arm around her throat, a pistol pressed to her head. The shooting stopped. Everyone froze. "That's far enough, Marshal," Sawyer called out. His cultured voice had an edge of hysteria now. "Everyone stays back or she dies." Brennan held up a hand, stopping his men. "Let her go, Sawyer. She's got nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with this. She's my insurance. You let me walk out of here and I'll release her once I'm clear. You know we can't do that." "Then she dies." Sawyer pressed the gun harder against the girl's head. She whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "Your choice, Marshal, her life or your pride." Will was moving before he fully realized what he was doing. He circled left, using the smoke and confusion for cover, getting closer. Sawyer was focused on Brennan, all his attention forward. He didn't see Will approaching from the side. 20 feet. 15. Will raised his rifle slowly, carefully, sighting down the barrel. It was a difficult shot. Sawyer was using the girl as a shield, only his head and right shoulder exposed. One mistake and the girl would die. Will thought about Emma, about the brand on her wrist, about the terror in her eyes when she'd looked at Sawyer's picture, about all the girls this monster had destroyed. He exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rifle spoke. Sawyer's head snapped back. The gun fell from his hand. He stood there for a moment, a look of surprise on his face, then collapsed. The girl stumbled forward and Garrett caught her, pulling her to safety. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Marshal Brennan's voice rang out. "It's over. Anyone still armed, throw down your weapons. You have 5 seconds." The remaining men complied. There were only 4 of them left alive, all wounded, all broken. The fight drained out of them the moment Sawyer fell. They dropped their guns and raised their hands, and it was truly over. Will lowered his rifle and looked at the body of Jacob Sawyer lying in the dirt. He thought he should feel something, victory maybe, or satisfaction. But all he felt was tired, so tired. Garrett approached him, his face smudged with powder smoke. Hell of a shot. Had to be. You all right? Will thought about it. Ask me tomorrow. They spent the next hours securing the mission and searching for more prisoners. They found 3 more girls locked in what had once been the priest's quarters. All were in poor condition, but alive. The Dr. Brennan had brought along tended to them while the deputies rounded up the survivors of Sawyer's gang. In a ledger hidden in the bell tower, they found everything. Names, dates, transactions. A complete record of Sawyer's operation spanning 3 years. Dozens of girls. Dozens of buyers. A network that stretched from Tucson to Chihuahua. The territorial government would be working through this evidence for months. As the sun set, they loaded the prisoners into wagons and prepared to head back to Tombstone. The girls rode in a separate wagon wrapped in blankets, silent and shell-shocked. Will looked at them and saw Emma as she'd been that first day. Broken, but breathing. Destroyed, but not dead. Marshal Brennan came over as Will was checking his horse's cinch. You did good work today, Morgan. I'll make sure that's in my report. Don't need recognition, just needed it done. Still, you saved that girl's life, ended a monster. That means something. Will mounted up. It means I can go home. The ride back was long and quiet. Men nursed wounds and processed what they'd seen. Some were jubilant, treating it like a victory. Others were somber, understanding the cost. Will rode apart from the others, lost in his own thoughts, counting the miles until he could see Emma again. They reached Tombstone after midnight. The town was dark, except for a few saloons still burning lamps. Brennan took the prisoners to the jail, while the doctor brought the girls to his office. Will gave his statement to Garrett, signed the necessary papers, and finally was free to leave. He rode through the night, pushing his horse harder than he should have driven by a need he couldn't quite name. The ranch appeared in the pre-dawn darkness, lamplight glowing in the kitchen window. Emma must have been waiting up. Will felt something loosen in his chest. He dismounted and climbed the porch steps. The door opened before he could knock. Emma stood there in her nightgown, her hair loose, her face pale with exhaustion. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then she was in his arms, holding him so tight he could barely breathe, and he was holding her just as tight, and neither of them spoke because there were no words for what they were feeling. It's done, Will said finally. Sawyer's dead. The girls are safe. It's over. Emma pulled back just enough to look at his face. Her hands cupped his cheeks, her thumbs tracing the lines of fatigue and smoke stains. Did you tell him? Did you tell him about me? No. But I made sure he knew his last moment on Earth, made sure he saw it coming. That had to be enough. Emma nodded slowly. Then she kissed him soft and lingering, and Will tasted salt from her tears. They went inside and Emma made him sit while she heated water. She washed his face and hands like he was a child, gentle and thorough, cleaning away the blood and dirt and powder smoke. Then she made him eat, even though he wasn't hungry. Only when she was satisfied did she let him speak. He told her everything. About the mission, about the fight, about the girls they'd rescued. He told her about Dutch, about how that particular demon would never hurt anyone again. He told her about Sawyer's last moments, about the ledger they'd found, about the network that was now exposed and would be dismantled. When he finished, Emma was crying quietly. 7 girls, she whispered. You saved 7 girls. We saved them. If you hadn't survived, hadn't told us where to look, we never would have found them. I didn't do anything. I just didn't die. That's not nothing, Emma. That's everything. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. What happens now? Now we live, we rebuild, we figure out what comes next. Together. Will took her hands in his. If you'll have me. Fresh tears spilled over. I'm broken, Will. I'm damaged. I have nightmares. I jump at shadows. I don't know if I'll ever be the person I was before. I don't care about who you were before. I care about who you are now. And Emma, you're the strongest person I've ever met. You survived something that would have destroyed most people. You're still here, still fighting. That's all that matters. I don't feel strong. You don't have to feel it for it to be true. Emma laughed through her tears. When did you become so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just a man who knows what he wants. And what's that? You, here, every morning, for as long as you'll stay. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. I'll stay. Promise. I promise. They sat like that as dawn broke outside, two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances, who'd fought together against darkness, who'd somehow impossibly found hope in the wreckage. In the days that followed, the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Will worked the land with renewed purpose, planning improvements he'd neglected for years. Emma tended the garden and the house, slowly claiming ownership of spaces that had been empty too long. The bedroom that had belonged to Sarah became hers. The kitchen that had produced nothing but simple meals became a place where good smells drifted. The porch where Will had sat alone for 3 years became a place where two people watched the sunset together. They didn't talk about the future, didn't make grand plans or promises. They just lived day by day, moment by moment, learning each other's rhythms and habits. Emma's nightmares came less frequently. Will's silences grew more companionable than haunted. Slowly, carefully, they built something neither had expected to find again. 2 weeks after the mission raid, a wagon appeared on the road. Emma saw it first and called to Will from the porch. He came out hand instinctively going to his gun, then relaxed when he recognized Marshal Brennan in the driver's seat. Brennan climbed down with a leather satchel under his arm. "Morgan, Miss Emma, hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Will said. "Coffee's on." They sat in the kitchen and Brennan spread papers across the table. "Wanted to update you on where things stand. All of Sawyer's men are in custody awaiting trial. The girls are recovering. 4 have been reunited with their families. The others are being placed with good people who'll look after them." "And the network?" Will asked. "Being dismantled as we speak. We've made arrests in Tucson, Bisbee, even across the border. Sawyer's ledger gave us everything we needed. It'll take time, but we'll get them all eventually." Brennan looked at Emma. "Because of your courage, Miss Emma. Because you survived and testified." Emma's voice was quiet. "I just told the truth. That truth is saving lives." Brennan pulled a document from the satchel. "Which brings me to why I'm here. The territorial government wants to compensate you. Officially, it's for testimony and assistance in the investigation. Unofficially, it's because they recognize what you've been through and want to help you start fresh." He slid the paper across to Emma. Her eyes widened when she saw the amount. $500. More money than she'd seen in her life. "I can't accept this," she said immediately. "You can and you will," Brennan replied firmly. "Use it however you want. Start a business, buy land, put it aside for a rainy day. But take it. You've earned it 10 times over." Emma looked at Will helplessly. He just nodded. "The marshal's right. Take it." She accepted the document with trembling hands. After Brennan left, she sat staring at it like she couldn't quite believe it was real. $500, she said softly. "I could go anywhere. Do anything." Will's heart clenched. "That's true." Emma looked up at him. "Where do you think I should go?" "That's your decision." "Is it?" She stood and crossed to where he sat. "Because I think I already know where I want to be." "Yeah. Here. With you, if the offer's still open." Will pulled her into his lap, holding her close. "The offer's permanent." "Good. Because I'm thinking we should use this money to fix up the ranch. New roof for the barn. Maybe expand the house. Build something that lasts." "Something that lasts," Will repeated. "I like the sound of that." Emma smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd finally found home. The seasons changed. Summer gave way to fall, the brutal heat softening into cool evenings and golden afternoons. The ranch transformed under their combined efforts. The barn got its new roof. The house gained a second bedroom and a proper kitchen. The garden flourished under Emma's care, producing more vegetables than they could eat. They sold the surplus in town, and the money combined with Emma's compensation began to accumulate. One October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the first stars appear, Emma said, "I've been thinking. About Sarah." Will tensed slightly. "What about her?" about how she'd feel, about me being here, in her house, in her life. Will was quiet for a long moment. You want to know what I think? Yes. I think Sarah would have liked you. I think she would have approved. She always said life was too short to waste on regret or loneliness. She'd want me to be happy. He looked at Emma. And I am. Happier than I've been in years. Happier than I thought I could be again. Emma's eyes filled with tears. I wish I could have known her. Me too. But Emma, you're not replacing her. You're not competing with a ghost. You're just you. And that's more than enough. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. Tell me something. When you found me that day, did you ever imagine we'd end up here? No. What did you imagine? Honestly, I thought you'd die, or recover and leave. I never imagined this. You staying, us building something together, this feeling like... He struggled for words. Like home, Emma finished softly. Yeah, like home. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness deepened around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang and another answered. The wind carried the smell of sage and dust and the promise of rain. The land stretched out before them harsh and beautiful, and for the first time in either of their lives it felt like they belonged to something larger than themselves. That night, as they prepared for bed, Emma stopped in the doorway of her room and turned to look at Will. Can I ask you something? Anything. The first day when I told you to kill me fast, why didn't you? Will thought about it. Really thought about it. Because I saw something in your eyes. Even through all the pain and fear, I saw someone who was still fighting, still alive. And I thought if she can keep fighting, who am I to take that away? And now, what do you see when you look at me now? He crossed to her and cupped her face gently in his hands. I see the woman I love. I see strength and courage and beauty. I see the future, my future, if you'll let it be. Emma's breath caught. Will Morgan, are you asking me to marry you? Not asking, not yet, just letting you know where I stand. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. She smiled through tears and kissed him softly. Thank you for everything, for finding me, for saving me, for showing me that life can still be good. Thank you for staying. They parted for their separate rooms, but both slept better that night than they had in months, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same blessed ordinary moments that made a life. Winter came to the Arizona territory with unusual gentleness that year. Instead of bitter cold and howling wind, it brought mild days and clear nights. Will and Emma spent the short days working side by side and the long evenings talking by the fire. They shared stories from their pasts, dreams for their future, comfortable silences that spoke louder than words. On Christmas Eve, Will rode into town and returned with a small wooden box. He set it on the table in front of Emma without a word. What's this? She asked. Open it. Inside was a silver ring, simple and unadorned, catching the firelight. Emma stared at it, her hand going to her throat. Will, it was my grandmother's, passed to my mother, then to me. I gave it to Sarah when we got married, and she wore it until the day she died. I buried her with it because I thought I'd never need it again. He took Emma's hand. But last week I went out to her grave and I talked to her, told her about you, about us. And I asked her permission to give you this ring. And Emma, I swear I felt her answer, felt her approval. So I dug it up and cleaned it, and now I'm giving it to you. I can't, this was Sarah's. Sarah's gone. I'll always love her, but she's gone. You're here. You're alive. You're the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. So I'm asking now properly. Emma, will you marry me? She was crying openly now, clutching the box to her chest. Yes. God, yes. 1,000 times, yes. Will slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. Then he pulled her close and kissed her, and it felt like beginning and ending all at once, like something sacred clicking into place. They were married in the spring when the desert bloomed. It was a small ceremony at the ranch, just Sheriff Garrett and his wife as witnesses, the territorial judge presiding. Emma wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself pale blue like the morning sky. Will wore his best shirt and pants and couldn't stop smiling. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Will kissed Emma like she was the most precious thing in the world, because she was. That evening, as they stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Emma said, "Do you think the girls remember me, the ones we saved? I think they remember that someone came for them, that someone cared enough to fight for them. Whether they remember your face or name doesn't matter. They carry the knowledge that they were worth saving. That's what matters. I hope they find what we found, this peace, this happiness. They will, in their own time, in their own way." Emma leaned into him, his arm coming around her shoulders automatically. "Tell me the story again, the one about how you found me. You've heard it a dozen times. I want to hear it again." So Will told the story. About the morning wind and the burlap sack and the woman who'd asked him to kill her fast. About the decision to save instead of surrender. About the long road from that moment to this one. Emma listened with her eyes closed, and when he finished, she said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd walked away, if you'd left me there? Every day, and every day I'm grateful I didn't." Me too. They stood together as darkness fell and the first stars emerged, two people who'd been broken by violence and healed by patience, who'd found in each other something neither had been looking for but both desperately needed. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite and carried with it the promise of rain, of renewal, of second chances that somehow impossibly came true. Inside the house, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming. The table was set for two. The bed they now shared was turned down and waiting. The life they'd built together piece by piece, day by day, stood solid and real around them. This was not the life Will Morgan had imagined when he'd buried his wife and retreated from the world. This was not the future Emma had seen for herself when she'd hung dying from a cottonwood tree, but it was the life they had, and it was good, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.